Tribal Issues and Emergency Management by Lauren Rooney. So some personal background about me and why I chose this topic is in my earlier years, I lived on a Navajo reservation in Arizona. It was located in Tuba City, right by the Four Corners, right up in the desert. There wasn't much to do, but I honestly could give you a whole presentation on my experiences while living there. My parents worked at the local hospital on the reservation. There's my mom. They basically were providing pharmaceutical aid to all the residents living on the reservation. Eventually, though, we did move from the reservation, and my mom later joined the public health service, so we moved back to Arizona, and she continued to work with Indian Health Services in Winslow, Arizona. There's me on the right. It was really beautiful over there. Native American tribes in the U.S. Now, I know most people know the history of Native Americans and the U.S. colonists in the very beginning, but I don't think people really understand how drastic our changes were when we came over from different countries. Before the American colonists, there were about 112 million Native Americans living here. Now they only make up about 2% of the American population, which is about 5.2 million in total. However, today the U.S. government recognizes the 562 different Native American tribes shown in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which establishes tribal differentiation from U.S. states and makes them sovereign within a state. Basically, they now have the right to govern themselves, and they don't have to follow strictly all of the state laws and rules put in place. Many people don't really understand how each tribe is so drastically different from one another. And typically in the past, American governments have grouped all tribes in the same category, but they can't do that because they all have their own individual customs, ways of life, belief systems. So saying that the Seminole Nation was exactly the same as the Navajo Reservation was a huge deal. So it's similar to U.S. states and how we all have our own ways of life, customs, even accents. It's a huge deal. So you can see that from this map I have that shows all the different tribes and where they were located in America before we came in and kind of disrupted this system. So FEMA and the Native American tribes, FEMA recognizes that they're individual tribes and they basically tailor all of their responses to this accordingly. However, there are trained personnel on site to help in the case of a disaster, and they basically work as liaisons. If there is a disaster, though, we have outside officials who are trained individuals that go into reservations and work hands-on with tribal nations, which is essentially what my parents were doing when we lived on the Navajo reservation. Now, although tribes are sovereign within their state, they are still part of the state. So that means that tribal leaders have to be included in any policy change or drafted litigation. This is super important because it helps to improve governmental cooperation between the tribes and U.S. officials, whereas in the past, there's been a lot of resentment towards U.S. government from tribal officials. So this helps to facilitate that cooperation. As I said before, government relations between Native Americans and the U.S. federal government have not always been so pleasant. Historically, tribal nations were tossed around in litigation without much regard for how they lived or any of their beliefs, and we can see that through the Dawes Act of 1887, the Indian Appropriation Act of 1871, and the termination policy during the Cold War. And all these laws either broke up their land, the U.S. government claimed that they didn't want to deal with tribal nation as a whole. They only wanted to deal with individuals, and they tried to assimilate Native Americans into American culture, which wasn't cool, nor was it possible for our tribal nations. So the U.S. politicians really didn't have much regard for Native American ways of life at that time. However, recently, there has been a lot more inclusion of tribal nations in the creation of new policies, which is really awesome because Native leaders are now given a voice and they can expect to be heard. And as we can see from this picture I have on the right, those are just some different important Native American people who have either joined politics or they've left the reservation and pursued different careers. They've gotten involved in really cool things through U.S. culture. Tribal leaders and emergency management. Tribal leaders are given the unique ability to directly request federal aid in the event of a disaster. And this was established under the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act of 2013. And it's very important because basically this is what differentiates regular emergent norms from tribal emergent norms. And it's because that they are sovereign within a state, they don't have to go through the typical bureaucratic process when responding to a disaster. So tribal leaders are essentially playing the role that a governor would for a state in case of a disaster. So that means that they have to manage resources and preparedness for their area. They have to coordinate mutual aid and assistance with local, state, and local jurisdictions. And some of their smaller responsibilities include the establishment of a deployment team for disaster response, and they have to actually initiate those mutual aid and assistance programs, which is important because although there may be aid assistance programs, someone has to actually go in and say, hey, we're going to initiate those programs for this disaster. So emergency officials in Native American tribes, we've got the Tribal Chief Executive Officer. And this person is basically the same as our regular Chief Executive Officer in other states, but they just have a little bit different responsibilities and rights. So they're responsible for organizing resources. They also possess extensive powers, meaning they can mandate local ordinances, telling people to evacuate the area. They also direct the flow of people, telling them where to get food and water if they needed it, or where to go, where for shelter. They're the ones directing where people are going and how they know what to do. Leadership is also extremely important for a tribal chief executive officer. People need to know what to do and where to go in the chaos of an emergency disaster. So leadership is an extremely important role of these officers. But it also includes dealing with the consequences of hazards and emergencies. So they are the ones who are kind of looked to if something goes awry in emergency response. They're also given the power to go to the state governor or the federal government directly. That's their special power. That's because these tribal nations are sovereign, so they don't have to go directly through the state. Now, that being said, if the emergency is not so big that it requires federal assistance, they can go to the governor and ask for state assistance and resources. But if it does end up being so big that their local officials or state officials can't cover it, they can go directly through federal assistance, which kind of gets rid of that second party who has to ask for assistance. So then finally we have the National Tribal Emergency Management Council. And this is a committee basically that provides support to all tribal nations, which includes resources, money, leadership and assistance. They can provide training for local officials who don't really know what to do. And it's basically just a backup support for any of the tribes who need a little bit of help or a little push in their emergency preparedness. So here are a list of my resources. Thank you guys for listening, and I hope you learned something.